Wow, wow, was für ein Tag. Jetzt geht's weiter.
Wow, what a day. Now we're continuing. And the next person speaking to us is also an educational giant. And the next section will concentrate on the conflict in the Middle East. We have the privilege to ask our questions to an educational giant who lives in Japan. Our fantastic KLA TV correspondent Dan from the US is interviewing him. So we're in Japan, US, Switzerland. We have a time difference of 15 hours between these two men and 7 and 8 hours of time shift to us here in Switzerland. So we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your valuable services. And first, look at the biography of whom? James Corbett. James, we need you.
James Corbett was born and raised in Canada. He graduated from Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, with a Master of Philosophy. After moving to Japan, James Corbett founded the website The Corbett Report in 2007 as a platform for independent critical analysis on politics, society, history, and economics. At the time, he ran the website alongside his job as an English teacher. About 4 years later, he became a full-time investigative journalist. Since then, he has received various awards for his journalistic work and has been a sought-after speaker at various universities, at TEDx Groningen, and before independent inquiry committees such as the National Citizens Inquiry in Canada. Over the years, James Corbett has released many revealing documentaries, such as 9/11 Suspects, A Century of Enslavement, The Story of the Federal Reserve, and Who is Bill Gates? His in-depth research is publicly available on his website and numerous channels in hundreds of episodes of podcasts, interviews, and other formats. Over 300,000 subscribers follow him on his social channels alone. In 2018, he launched the annual Fake News Awards, in which he points out the most skewed news from the system media. Today, James Corbett speaks about the topic, Middle East conflict and digital central bank currency, an absolute horror scenario.
James Corbett, thank you for coming on again.
No problem.
So today we're going to be talking about war in the Middle East and CBDCs. So if you're ready and our listeners are ready, we'll get right into it. Listeners, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Let's start off with this. You have called October 7th Israel's 9/11. How so? How do these two things line up?
Well, obviously, it's not just me who has called that, who has used that phrase. In fact, the mainstream establishment media was using that phrase in the immediate wake of the October 7th attacks. And of course, they mean it in the context of a spectacular large-scale terror attack that was exactly as we were told it was, which justifies an ongoing, presumably never-ending war on terror. I use it in a very different way because, as people who are familiar with my work will know, I have deconstructed the 9/11 false flag terror events from many different angles, including looking at the money trail, looking at the war games that were operative on 9/11, looking at some of the suspects and characters surrounding 9/11, the intelligence operatives and agencies that were actively working with, collaborating, creating, in many senses, Al-Qaeda, aka Al-Qaeda. So from that perspective, when I say October 7th was Israel's 9/11, I mean it in that context, as in a staged or provocateur false flag event that has been used as a justification for a military/political agenda that was already there in advance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, when you say never ending, the way I see it is that Israel certainly does have motives in Gaza. Do you foresee some way to end this war in Gaza? How does it end? Is it supposed to end? I mean, the never-ending part is like if they can continue having enemies surrounding them, then they will continually tap into the U.S. Treasury to keep the arms shipments going. But speaking of Gaza alone, do you foresee an end to this?
I unfortunately do see how it could come to an end. And unfortunately, most of the alternatives for that are not pleasant ones. They involve the eradication of the Palestinian people from Gaza. And in fact, that is something that has been alluded to by numerous ministers in the Israeli parliament who have talked about erasing Gaza or talked about eliminating the Palestinian people. And unfortunately, these people are, of course, dismissed as, oh, those are the extreme fringe far right people. They don't represent the majority of the Israeli government. But it is interesting to note that Netanyahu's political coalition depends on precisely those types of people at the moment. So it's not such a fringe idea in Israeli politics that this does end with actually the ethnic cleansing of Gaza in particular. And of course, then there's the question of the West Bank, which for years has been the open and concerted policy of much of the Israeli political class to continue and expand the illegal settlements that are happening in the West Bank. And in fact, just recently, just in the past week, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, has come up with its provisional ruling saying that Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories is illegal, confirming once again, yes, this is an illegal occupation that is going on, and that Israel must make every effort to stop what they are doing as soon as possible. But what does that look like? And unfortunately, as I say, I can see many ways that this could end in Gaza in particular, say with the complete eradication of the Palestinian people, or at least the displacement of enough people to make continued Palestinian survival in Gaza untenable, or at the very least to open up new avenues and new territory for settlement by Israelis in the Gaza Strip. But from anything resembling a military perspective, as if Hamas was really fighting in a war against the Israeli government, and that there really are two forces that are lined up battling each other, and it could go either way, I think that's a false narrative that's been implanted. What is happening there is not a war. Yeah. It is a slaughter, a wholesale slaughter that is taking place right now.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed.
And if we're going to extrapolate beyond Gaza and go to the West Bank, we could say, Jerusalem, Golan Heights, each one of these places. So we could extrapolate and say that possibly the goal is the eradication of the Palestinians from all of Israel. Could we not?
As I say, this is not an extrapolation or a theory. This is something that has been actively and openly talked about, at least by certain members of the Israeli parliament. And when they do this, when those ministers come out and mouth these statements, Netanyahu generally will come out and make some sort of statement. Oh, that's too far. Oh, we don't support that idea. But of course, as I say, that the political coalition that is holding Netanyahu's government together actually depends on the very ministers making these types of statements. And there are numerous of them. In fact, I'm working on documenting that for an upcoming podcast episode right now. So I'm just looking at this data right now, and I can say there are numerous documented evidence statements of numerous Israeli politicians calling for the eradication of the Palestinian people. So this is not some sort of fringe idea that's just floated by a few people. This is floated by people in positions of power, and it is, as I say, at least one way we could imagine this conflict coming to an end, but in the worst way imaginable.
Yes. Well, and Netanyahu will moderate his statements depending on who's listening. I mean, he may try to downplay the idea, but then on another day, he may equate the people in Gaza to Amalek.
Yes.
Who need to be eliminated.
And of course, this does have to do with Israeli internal politics and political cycles. And there is a documented pattern in Netanyahu's career where he will make the most provocative and most forthright statements about the most hawkish policy towards the Palestinians in times of tightly contested political elections. He'll be essentially campaigning for that right-wing vote that is keeping him in office. But then we also run into the risk of blaming this all on Netanyahu. Certainly he is a dominant force in Israeli politics and has been for decades now, but he's not the only force. And we run the risk of assuming that, oh, well, if we could just get a more level-headed Israeli prime minister in, like Naftali Bennett or Ehud Barak, Jeffrey Epstein associate, or someone else like that, well, then things would just be fine. But I think that's a false narrative that's been implanted in this conversation. It is a fundamental question that is at the heart of Israeli politics right now and has been since the foundation of the Israeli state in the terrorist attacks that formed the Israeli state that we know about. Again, this is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history. For example, the attack on the King David Hotel back in 1946, which was at the time the largest terror attack in history and something that absolutely shocked the conscience of the world, killing dozens, hundreds of people, injuring many, many more. It was an absolutely brazen attack, and it was specifically a terrorist attack committed by what would become the Israeli, essentially political establishment, as part of their ploy to get the British out of Palestine. And unfortunately, it was very successful. So right from the very beginning, the foundations of the Israeli state have been predicated on terrorism and violence against Palestinians. And unfortunately, nothing has changed in the last 75 years.
When you say that this terrorist group became the political establishment, are you referring to the Irgun?
Yes, and in fact, the name is going to escape me, but I did document this in my recent podcast episode about Meet Benjamin Netanyahu, War Criminal, where the particular Irgun leader who was in charge of the King David Hotel operation and was responsible for that terrorist atrocity was not only lauded by Netanyahu as an exemplar of the foundation of the Israeli state. He was one of the founding fathers of the Israeli state. But in fact, in 2006, on the 60th anniversary of that deadly terrorist bombing, not only was a plaque commemorating the event unveiled by the Israeli government, which even at the time, the British ambassador said it was absolutely remarkable to have a free and democratic, liberal democratic state literally putting up a monument to a horrible, deadly terrorist attack. But who was there to unveil the plaque and to once again commemorate the Irgun for and commend the Irgun for their part in founding the Israel on this deadly event? None other than Benjamin Netanyahu.
Is the Netanyahu government connected to Hamas somehow?
Yes, they are. And once again, I've documented this in my work. I wrote an article a few months ago called The Secret History of Hamas that goes into the founding of Hamas, what it is, where it came from, and the extensive Israeli government and intelligence connections between the Israeli government and Hamas. And I think it would be too simplistic to say that simply Hamas is a complete fabrication, a total puppet of the Israeli government, but demonstrably so. It has been propped up, aided, funded, and abetted by the Israeli government. And in fact, in a 2019 Likud party meeting, Benjamin Netanyahu explicitly said that his strategy was to prop up Hamas in order to keep the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip separated politically and ideologically from the Palestinians in the West Bank in order to make sure that they could never unite and never form a real threat of actually succeeding in creating a two-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So this is again out in the open. We don't have to speculate about this.
James, speaking of the need to keep wars going in general, I watched maybe your most recent video, and you mentioned an article on Covert Action Magazine. And I went to Covert Action Magazine. I don't know if I read the correct article, but it was by a guy who said that that's been the United States MO from the very beginning, to keep the wars going. Would you say, generally speaking, that's the case in the Middle East, and that's the case in Ukraine today, and that's the case for the United States?
I would say as a general modus operandi, that is the way that the military-industrial complex that was identified by Eisenhower on his way out of the U.S. presidential office back in 1960, and that is even more in force than it was at that time. And that has been the modus operandi of that military-industrial complex since its inception. War is the health of the state, but war is also the health of every industry and ancillary body and intelligence agency and all of these other organs of the larger deep state that is actually governing politics. And because of that, they have not just a vested interest, not just a hidden interest. Their interest is equal to the interest of warfare and continually generating reasons for military action. So yes, absolutely, this is part of the strategy. I think it holds more true in certain times and certain places for specific strategic reasons. And we can look at that historically. For example, in the 1980s, the explicit reason for funding, in fact, the largest, at least admitted CIA operation in history was the funding of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1980s as part of their war jihad against the Soviets, was specifically and precisely because the Carter administration deep state back in the late 1970s decided that the best way to drain the blood of the Soviets was to put them in a meat grinder, give them their own Vietnam. So that was specifically and explicitly what they did. And they tried to keep that war going for as long as they possibly could. That was the strategy behind it.
Wow. Yeah.
In the same way, you could see, for example, the conflict in Ukraine is I think, an exact parallel, because in this case, again, I think the target is clearly Russia, and the United States is happy to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, and will continue sending money and aid and weapons to enable that conflict to go on as long as it possibly can to drain the Russians.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
Well, I think Trump has recently said that he intends to stop this war. If he stopped the war, then the meat grinder would stop too. But I think he has other reasons for stopping the war. We'd like to hear a little bit about your thoughts on the current state of the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. And let's think of the prime movers for going to and continuing the war against Russia. What is it that people like Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken, our Secretary of State, what do they want? What is their goal over there?
You know, this is a good question, and I guess it's a question of how far back into geopolitical history you want to go, because certainly I think that the strategy of empire, the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, the American Empire as it became in the 20th century, has been for a very long time to keep the Russians and the Germans separated and to keep them at war with each other, essentially. Because, of course, if they were to unite, even not politically, not economically, but just to have good relations with each other, that would be a serious threat to the ability of, say, the British or the Americans to come in and control the European continent. And as has been pointed out since the times of Mackinder and all of the formation of geopolitics as we know it today over a century ago, that area of the global chessboard, as it's been called, is the heartland over which whatever ruling power happens to have control will have essentially control of the planet. And that has been understood for over a century, which is precisely why there has always been the need to drive a wedge in between Russians and Germans or Europeans generally. Yes. And I think that's still operative today. That's still a part of the strategy.
Yes, I was doing an interview with, who's the anti-war guy? He does the great anti-war podcast.
Scott Horton.
Scott Horton. Yeah, Scott Horton. And he said, the last thing the West wants is a German-Russian unity. And he says, then again, the worst possible thing is that Germany and Russia would ever go back to war against each other again. And we've seen what happens. when that takes place.
Yes, we have.
Back to Trump saying he's going to stop this war. What do you know about his good friend, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, who happens to be working as an advisory role on reconstruction efforts in Ukraine?
User
And
disconnected
he's
from
in
your
charge of the Ukraine Development Fund.
Yes. So as you exactly outlined there, BlackRock, and specifically Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, which, by the way, is the largest investment firm in the world, which has a, if not a plurality, at least a large portion of the shares in basically every Fortune 500 company, is also heavily invested in the Ukrainian reconstruction, which of course has been put in the context of a digital transformation. This process, in fact, was in place even before the current conflict started, but it's certainly been ramped up. And Larry Fink has openly talked about how this provides a perfect opportunity for the complete digital transformation of a government and economy. So that is exactly what they are attempting to do. Of course, this is a boon and a boondoggle in the terms of billions of euros, billions of dollars for whoever can get their snoot in this particular pie and drink the most from it. And Larry Fink is definitely positioned to be that blood-sucking vampire on the face of humanity right now.
I was looking into the background of Larry Fink and his involvement in Ukraine and his meddling over there. And I found out about a conference that occurred in New York City a couple of years ago. Have you ever heard of the New York Times sponsored Deal Book Summit?
I have heard of it, yes, but I was not following its proceedings.
Right. Well, I read the fine print. It said Prime Minister designate Benjamin Netanyahu, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, and BlackRock CEO Larry Fink will also address the summit. All those people together at a New York summit. Any thoughts on that?
Only that it doesn't surprise me in the least. I would say that's exactly who we would expect to be gathering to talk about this and to, again, try to profit from this in every way, monetarily as well as geopolitically as well as militarily. And of course, every player at that table has their own reason for being at that table, but they can certainly unite on the agenda of using up the lifeblood of Ukraine to fight the Russians is something that a lot of different people at the table are happy to do right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, James, you didn't seem very sanguine about the possible outcomes of the current crisis in Israel. What's a semi-reasonable best case scenario for the war in Ukraine to end without BlackRock taking over the country?
Yes. Well, again, that is exceptionally difficult now. And I think everyone has played their hands to the point where it's difficult to imagine that there would be a way to step back from that brink right now. Because, of course, I think the Russians cannot back off at this point without having achieved at least some sort of face-saving measure over the Donbass and its supposed geopolitical objectives there. But at the same time, Ukraine has been committed now quite firmly onto a path that is towards Western integration, including NATO membership, which at the most recent NATO conference, it was assured that Ukraine's NATO membership path is irreversible. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen, which of course was the red line that the Russians have set for a very, very long time, even pre-Putin. The idea of NATO in Ukraine has been that red line. So it is, again, it's difficult to imagine a face-saving measure that would be possible at this point that wouldn't, at the very least, as you say, even if it were all to end, even if the conflict were to end tomorrow, clearly we have ensconced in Kiev right now a government that is committed towards this digital transformation, BlackRock takeover, Palantir, and other companies like that are getting into this game right now. It's difficult to imagine how they would be kicked out of any conceivable government that's taking place in Kiev right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, James, we're going to move on to our second topic here, CBDCs. And I'd like to open this with a little news just from this weekend, I guess beginning on Thursday. I've had my head down, just work a day, and haven't been thinking about stuff, and haven't really been researching or looking much at my Twitter feed. So I didn't know much about this whole CrowdStrike affair. In fact, I didn't even know what CrowdStrike was until I asked someone today that it's a software security company. But something happened on Friday, I think it was, and that was for some reason I couldn't access any sort of digital records at my bank. I have an app on my phone which allows me to see my bank account and transactions, and they said down for the weekend. And then my buddy said, yeah, could very well possibly be because of the CrowdStrike thing. He mentioned hundreds of flights being canceled. He mentioned YouTube being down this morning for 3 hours, banks closing, etc. My thought was, as we get into this talk about CBDCs, my thought was, this should be a black eye to the idea of changing everything to digital. Don't you think people might be concerned about being able to access cash and spending and not depending 100% on this digital money that they're trying to roll out?
I'm glad that you put this discussion in that context, because right now, at least at this very moment, there are tens of thousands, maybe more, who have had their travels disrupted, their bank accounts disrupted, etc., because of this. Wow, this once in a lifetime. This is a horrible glitch that has just taken hold. But it should, at the very least, be at the forefront of people's minds right now, whether it is a good idea to actually put our entire lives, our economic existence on the line of this digital technology that, at the very least, is susceptible to random glitches and false updates, let alone actual attacks, whether real from actual outside boogeymen, or from a false flag attack that's generated in some way, or maybe just an act of God. We know the EMF, the solar radiation, the Carrington event. We know the types of things that could come along to destroy and disrupt our electronic lives as we know them at a moment's notice. So in a sense, what I saw taking place recently with that CrowdStrike problem was almost hardening to see paper boarding passes being written out for passengers because they couldn't print electronic boarding passes. They couldn't use the QR codes. So they were literally handwriting them. And it does, at the very least, it does make you think just how far we have been steeped into this digital matrix that seeing a handwritten boarding pass is somewhat shocking in this day and age. But yes, people used to keep track of things with pen and paper. Why have we abandoned that? What pressing, urgent problems have we solved by putting our entire lives into this digital matrix?
I think you could say that for so many things, that they come up with a new solution to something. And the first question we should be asking is, well, what's wrong with what we have here? I get pretty good reception, at least when I was back in Japan, on the old 3G network. Why 4G? Why 5G? They keep ramping it up, telling us that this is absolutely necessary for our continued existence. But I don't need to download a movie in 19 seconds instead of 53 seconds.
Allow me to insert a reference here to Neil Postman, who was the author of books like Amusing Ourselves to Death. He was a very interesting and very foresightful author who was productive and active in the 1980s and 1990s. He was writing about the internet as that was coming into existence. And he delivered a series of speeches on questions about technology, and I can't remember the name that speech is under. But if you look up Neil Postman questions about technology, you will find it. And he, I believe, came up with 4 questions that we should ask about any new technology that is being proposed. One of which is, what is the problem to which this proffered technology is purportedly the solution? And is it really a problem? And is it really a solution? And he breaks that down in an excellent way that I think is even more relevant now than it was when he was delivering that speech 3 decades ago.
Well, that sounds interesting. James, I know we covered this on our last interview, but we have a lot more new viewers watching this in the AZK conference. And I think some people still need to know, what is the difference between CBDCs and, for example, Apple Pay or other digital payment systems? And why are 93% of all central banks suddenly actively involved in developing these CBDCs?
The digital payment infrastructure as it exists right now, that you tap into right now, is predicated on the form of money that we have become used to, which is to say the retail money in the retail banking circuit. Now, what we have to understand, there's a lot to understand with regards to monetary jiggery pokery and nonsense that the would-be wizards of Wall Street have pulled, the wool that they've pulled over the eyes of the general public for many, many centuries now. But the idea is there is a two-track monetary system in most countries today. One is the wholesale monetary system, which is for the banks themselves, the commercial banks. They themselves have reserve accounts at the central bank, and whether that's the ECB or the Bank of Japan or the Federal Reserve in the United States, those commercial banks store reserves and transact with each other within that wholesale banking circuit. You and I and everyone else listening to this, we have our funds at those commercial banks, and that is the retail monetary circuit. Those are two completely separate things. The money that the banks are using in the wholesale circuit is technically a different thing than the money that we use in the day-to-day retail banking circuit. And so when we're paying with Apple Pay or what have you, we are using retail banking money. That is money that is created through the retail bank, the commercial banking system. Generally speaking, money, most of it, at any rate, is created out of debt that's owed back to the commercial banks. They, by the magic of their bank charter, have the right to create that money into existence when they loan it out to you. They're not going into the bank vault and taking out a stack of cash every time they loan you money. They are creating that money that then you owe back to them with interest. A wonderful idea if you happen to be a banker, at any rate. Now, what CBDC is the idea that we will have access, really for the first time, directly to central bank issued money. Well, of course, there is central bank issued money. If you take out one of the bills, whatever country you happen to be residing in, if you take out one of the paper bills, if you happen to have any left in your wallet, because most people are going cashless, it will say something like, here in Japan, it says Bank of Japan on it. In the United States, it says Federal Reserve Note, because that is an expression of central bank liability. That bill is actually issued by the central bank itself. And so that is the only way that the central bank has for putting money directly into the economy at this point. And it's just a fraction of the economy at this point. However, in the CBDC universe, they will be able to put their expressions of central bank liability directly into your digital wallet, because you will now have an account, well, depending how they set it up, but in some way or other, you will have an account with the central bank itself. And they will be able to not only, of course, verify and look over your transactions, but of course, look into your transactions, and potentially, as has been pointed out by many, including politicians in the UK and elsewhere, who are very, very excited about this possibility, they can program what can and cannot happen with that money. So, for example, if they put a restriction, you are only allowed a certain amount of meat that can be purchased this month, because we know eating meat is bad for it angers the weather gods. If they put a restriction on it, they will be able to enforce that restriction by stopping you from purchasing over your allotment of meat with their central bank digital currency. And that will be an automatic thing that will not be bypassable by you if they choose to implement it that way. Or any other number of restrictions that one could imagine could be enacted in real time with the flip of a digital switch, which presents an absolutely nightmarish amount of control over the economy directly by central bankers.
Yep. I mean, you just answered my next question, which was, what would you say would be the most attractive thing for the state? And I would say it's the ability to accurately monitor our wealth and spending, and if need be, control how we spend.
Absolutely. And I should make the distinction, because it is, as I have laid out, as the banking system exists right now, the commercial banks are our go-between between the central bank and ourselves. So the commercial banks have been an important part of that, and they obviously wield an incredible amount of control over the economy right now. They're not going to give up that control very easily. So we could imagine many ways that the CBDC system will be set up, one of which could be that the central bank will delegate its ability to host and to verify accounts to commercial banks, or at least verified financial institutions. So they will act, again, as the middlemen in this. And that will put the central banks at something at least looking like an arm's length remove from the process. Oh, we're not controlling all of this. This is done by the commercial banks. However, given, again, the political and economic realities of the way the banking system is structured, of course, who is it that regulates those commercial banks and tells them what they can and cannot do? It is the central bank regulators and the government regulators. And we have seen how that power has been abused in the past. For example, under the Obama administration, the Department of Justice leaned on the commercial banks in the United States to debank people who were engaged in completely legal, if disreputable, services. Porn stars, ammo dealers, payday lenders, other people in the parts of the economy that the government wasn't so happy with. They were leaning on those banks to debank those customers. The banks themselves were the ones complying. They were the ones debanking those customers, but they were doing it because the FDIC in the United States, one of the regulators of the banking system, was saying, we won't insure your deposits. We might delist you if you don't comply with our demands to get rid of these people. So we can see how this type of system can be erected that will, again, not look exactly like that most nightmare scenario of central bankers directly controlling your wallet, but it will amount to pretty much the same thing.
Yes, I can see how they're going to try to make it palatable. They're going to say, and this is one of those, first they came for the communist things. First they came for the money lenders down on Skid Row. Well, we don't like those people. We don't like the porn stars. They're going to make it attractive. So how close are we to a CDC system? And does this mean the end of cash?
They can certainly coexist, and presumably will coexist for some time. It doesn't necessarily mean that there will be no such thing as cash. However, we have seen already the moves towards cashless society and how quickly that has happened, to the point where in Japan, still a largely cash-based economy, although that is changing. But I remember last year I was in England attending a conference, and it was genuinely shocking, although I consciously know this and have researched this and talked about it, but it was genuinely shocking to walk into numerous cafes and restaurants and retail outlets that literally did not accept cash. It was literally cashless only. And again, that was something of a shock to my system. But it is already happening. So one could imagine when CBDCs are introduced, yes, there will be a period of coexistence, but one could very much imagine that given some false flag monetary event or other as a presumed emergency justification, you could get rid of cash. And most people in this day and age probably wouldn't bat an eyelid.
Right. Well, when you visit the local convenience store, how many people do you see paying with these with their iPhone, with a card, with an Easy Pay card rather than cash? I mean, is it pretty common?
Unfortunately so. And I say unfortunately because, again, I have very much delighted in the fact that Japan was it still is largely a cash-based economy, to the point where you could go in and buy a car with cash and it wouldn't even be a surprising event. However, that is changing, and it's changing very quickly over here as the cashless payment systems are not just rolled out, but actively promoted more and more. And unfortunately, now it is becoming a much, much more common occurrence to see people paying with their phones, paying with their cards than it was in the past. So even here in Japan, which has been one of the few holdouts in the developed world in terms of being a cash-based economy, that is changing. And I could imagine within a few short years, we will probably see the tip over point where cashless payments will become more common than cash payments.
What can we do besides make sure we pay with cash whenever possible? What other things are in our quiver?
Well, I would say that is a very, very good place to start. And I think this is one of those problems that is clearly, it's a societal issue that no one person can solve for themselves, but we all have our part to play in it. And our part consists in boycotts and boycotts, as in not only to avoid stores that go cashless, but then of course to support those stores or businesses or retailers or people that you know who are willing to provide services, not only for cash, precious metals, crypto, Let's system, or other versions of community currencies, whatever it is. I'm not here to adjudicate on what system people should be using. I think use everything other than the CBDCs. And it is one of those things where as long as we flex that muscle and continue to build a community around that at the very least will be supported in the event of this changeover, so that when as the cashless rollout happens and as more and more people go down that road, if there are still people who are willing to go even out of their way, inconvenience themselves if need be, in order to pay with cash or precious metals or something else, well, then that economy can at least continue. And certainly most people will probably go along to get along, but the avenue for people to support that community will be there. But if we don't flex that muscle, if we just, oh, well, it's kind of inconvenient, I just want to go down to the convenience store and buy that thing, I guess I'll have to go cashless this time. The more that we do that, the more we are literally buying into that cashless world. So it does come down to a system of habits. And we have to get used to being inconvenienced if need be in order to support the world we want, in order to avoid the world we don't want.
Amen to that, Jim. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. I like to, when I can, throw in something that's off script and something personal that I came up with myself. I want to describe a hypothetical situation to you, James, and see how you would react in this situation. I know this is going to be bantered about. It's being bantered about so much, and there's rampant speculation, and in a ways that kind of bothers you when we get off track and go rabbit holes. But I have to ask you something about the alleged July 13th assassination attempt. Would that be okay?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So let's say you're leading a conference, and the question of the July 13th alleged assassination attempt comes up. People get excited. There's all kinds of speculation about what really happened, and you kind of get off track. You take your gavel, you knock it down. What do you do to keep people focused and on the right track in such a situation? What would you say?
Well, I think at the point at which the people have expressed their interest in that, it's probably already too late to simply gavel it away. I would never presume to tell people what they should be thinking about or what they should be devoting their time or attention to, or at least telling them that they can't devote their time or attention to this or that thing. And even if I did, who would listen to me and why? However, I could certainly suggest that what the significance of an event like that, to me, as someone who does not believe in the political system and process that we've been given, the slave suggestion box that comes along every 4 years, that means nothing with regards to the overarching problems of central bank digital currencies and the conflict in Israel and Ukraine and other things that we've been talking about today. The real meaning of this is not about this or that political candidate. It's about what the people who control this system want us to believe about what took place and why they want us to believe that. So if I could, in such an imaginary situation, gavel down one way or another, I would simply say it might be more useful to look at what does this mean? Why are we being propagandized to think and talk about this event in a certain way? Whose interest does this redound to? If we accept this narrative as it is being shoved down our throats, where does that lead us, and to what end? And if for no other reason, then perhaps just to draw us back into the political discussion and to make it again about which which side of this controlled left-right bird of prey do you want to support politically, if only to draw people back into that sideshow circus. That might be the actual real meaning of an event like this. And so I would at least put that out on the table for discussion.
Very good. Very good. Okay, final question, James. Final question. Were you surprised when Julian Assange was freed?
I suppose so, if only because I think that the long-term narrative, like a Ukraine conflict or an Afghanistan conflict or what have you, it seems like just keeping it in that process, in that state, almost seemed like it had become the point at a certain point. Certainly, it would... I don't want to say this. It would be interesting to have seen how that would have played out judicially, but I'm not sure I would want to have seen how that played out judicially. At any rate, it certainly took me by surprise. I was not expecting that. I don't take it as a wonderful win for free speech.
Sure.
If only because, again, all that was really decided was that, yes, guilty, I'm guilty, now let me out. And that doesn't really help the fundamental problems of setting this precedent that normal journalistic practices are illegal. And that's essentially what has been determined here. Now, luckily, it could have been worse because they could have actually had an actual judicial verdict that what he did was illegal, which would have set a worse precedent. But it certainly could have been better, as in finding someone who was just doing a journalistic job innocent of the charges would have been much better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We could say that maybe, we should celebrate that he's free, but our celebrations should be somewhat muted given that it came about because of a plea deal.
We should, as always, continue to point out the facts and the issues surrounding this case rather than dwelling on the personalities of people involved in them.
Agreed. Well, AZK conference attendees, how about a nice round of applause for James Corbett?
Wonderful. Thank you. You've brought these deep connections to the table. We value and we love you. Thank you, Dan, for guiding this so fantastically.